Hello, everyone. We're just giving everyone a few minutes to join live here on the webinar, as well as on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. All right, I'm gonna get us started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests and audience from New York at the UN General Assembly, from Doha, and from around the world. Thank you for joining us again today. My name is Anna Rold, and I am the publisher and CEO of Diplomatic Courier and your host for today's forum, which is the second edition of 4 that Qatar Foundation, in collaboration with the permanent mission of the state of Qatar to the UN and Diplomatic Courier magazine, are hosting in light of UN Global Goals Week. Our first session in the series was yesterday. We hosted leaders from the UN and civil society who discussed the intersection of education and climate action from an interdisciplinary approach. And that session is now available as a recording on Qatar Foundation social media channels. And just like yesterday, today and the next 2 days, you can join us on this webinar live on Zoom, where as a registered participant, you can interact directly with our moderators, our hosts, and our speakers, or you can join us on live stream on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And wherever you are joining us from, we would love to know who you are and how we may be able to pose your questions and comments to our speakers. Also, do let us know how you're working towards solving the UN SDGs. After all, as I've said before, the SDGs are everyone's business. And it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today's session, Robert Hawkins, the Global Lead for Technology and Innovation in Education at the World Bank Group. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to be here with everybody today. It's an honor to be able to share with you some of the work that we're doing at the World Bank and some of the challenges we face. I'm just going to set a bit of the context for the discussion around impact investing and opportunities for bringing more resources, energy, networks to the challenges that school systems around the world face. I think the first important point is that before COVID hit, we were in the midst of an education crisis. And we look at education crises in the lens of the number of 10-year-olds that can read a simple sentence. We call this learning poverty. And the numbers are stark across the countries that we work in some cases as low as 30% of 10-year-olds who cannot read a simple paragraph. So we start from that perspective. The other challenge we face is the inequality in terms of just financing for education. When we look at the three major sources of funding, governments, household, and development partners, all of them have been under stress as a result of COVID. And some of the figures that existed before COVID in terms of the disparity of financing, and I'm just going to read from one of our reports here, that by the age of 18, the average child growing up in a low-income country will have attended school for only 8 years, compared to 13 for a high-income country. And overall, the average low-income country government will have invested around $1,300 on the child's education, while the average high-income country will have spent $110,000, about 43 times as much. So these are some of the challenges that we faced before COVID. COVID has exacerbated this crisis. Where I sit, I focus on the intersection of technology, innovation, and education. What we've also seen is an incredible increase on lending demand for EdTech. As a result of all the school closures, countries are looking at ways in which to reach students that are not able to get in school, whether in urban areas or in rural areas. And what we've developed, I want to share with you and maybe set a little bit of a context for the discussion, Anna, is a strategy paper that we've just published that outlines 5 principles. And I'm going to just talk through the 5 principles and try to relate them as well to this financing challenge. So the first one is ask why. So anytime that we engage with a partner government, the first question we ask with regard to investments in EdTech is why? What is the change that you want to see in the classroom? What are the changes that you want to see in terms of the skills, attitudes, behaviors of students, but then also teachers? And what we found is that the investments in EdTech are providing a unique opportunity to think differently about the delivery of education services. And this is an important opportunity as well in thinking about ways in which to crowd in additional financing and to think about this vast gap that we see between high-income countries and low-income countries, both to support governments to more effectively use those resources and to think differently about the deployment of those resources, but also households and how we can crowd in additional financing. The second principle that we have is at scale for all. So again, any investment, we need to think of the most marginalized first. And if we think about designing EdTech interventions for the most marginalized, it'll be more easily scalable to the entire population. I think the other important aspect of this principle is the aspect of human-centered design, of being able to design programs that meet the needs of your end users and getting down to the teachers and the students, the principals, the schools themselves in terms of what are their actual needs, how do they use technology, what are their bottlenecks. And I think this is an important opportunity also when we think about financing, is how do we empower those end users, those schools, to be able to take budget decisions, to be able to identify what their financing needs are, and to be able to use those resources most effectively. The third principle is empower teachers. That at the end of the day, education is a social endeavor, and teachers are at the center of any effective educational process. And what we've done a lot of thinking about with our clients is ways in which technology, one, can kind of maybe help take a bit of the administrative burden off of teachers, but then also can empower teachers to be innovative, can find solutions to problems, can network with other teachers. And one of the big challenges that we found as a result of COVID and the move to online and remote learning are teacher skills and digital skills. And this is a big issue, not just for teachers, but for students as well. What are these skills? What are the types of skills that both teachers and students need in the future? How do you define these skills? How do you integrate them into a curriculum, whether it's a teacher training curriculum or a normal curriculum at whatever grade? How do you then measure these skills? And then how do you kind of support the further development and scaffolding of these skills? So empowering teachers is an important principle. The fourth one, which I think is particularly important for this discussion in this group, is engaging the ecosystem. That any deployment of EdTech cannot be implemented only by a Ministry of Education alone. It's important to kind of look beyond the ministry, to look at the other stakeholders in the country, regionally and globally. And this also came out during during COVID is the way that governments began to look at, for instance, digital content, looking at kind of what countries had existing digital content. We have projects, one that I'll mention in Turkey, for instance, the government is explicitly looking at ways in which to build EdTech ecosystems. And the way they're doing it is very unique in the sense that they are looking at identifying kind of the stakeholders, looking at different ways to finance these early stage ideas. And in many cases, it's grant-based. It might move to be matching grants, for instance. It might move into kind of some startup seed funding. So this whole mix of different financing models to incentivize the stakeholders, the innovators, the solution providers in a country to provide new solutions to a system is critical. The other interesting aspect is the integration of those solution providers and those solutions with the teachers. Again, engaging the ecosystem with empowering teachers. Because at the end of the day, teachers need to be empowered and convinced that an innovation or a solution will work for their problem. So what Turkey's doing in other countries that we've worked with is thinking differently about teacher professional development, looking at ways in which to support teachers to be innovators in the sense of identifying those challenges, testing those challenges, evaluating the impact of those challenges, and sharing those results with a cohort of other teachers. So this idea of looking at professional development as a way to empower teachers as innovators is kind of an interesting take. And also an important aspect in terms of the ecosystem responding to the demands of the end user, which at the end of the day will be the teacher in the classroom. So this is an important principle. And then finally, the last principle that we work on is be data-driven, that we need to be able to take existing evidence, to be able to build off of global knowledge, to help ministries of education, schools not reinvent the wheel, but also to change the culture and mindset at ministries of education and all education institutions to be more iterative in their approach, to be a bit more risk-taking in terms of trying new ideas, evaluating those ideas, gathering the data, and then adjusting the system based on those data. So creating a learning culture is kind of essential in this process. A few of the choke points on the data side that I think would be interesting to discuss during this panel are challenges around systems themselves. That many systems in ministries of education have gone beyond just a data collection system to really learning systems, where in many of our countries we have 80 some odd systems that don't talk to each other. There's your payroll system, your human resource system, and now you have your content management system, your learning management system, your teacher training system. So one of the opportunities is how do we look at reforming these systems, taking a more enterprise architecture approach, I guess, making them more modular and interoperable. The idea being that the data would be more effectively used, but then also solution providers could come in and not have to provide a full stack solution, but provide pieces of the solution. And it also de-risks the investment that the ministries of education have to. The other interesting aspect of this is then how do we change the idea of procurement and contracting? And what are the different business models that we have to think about to be able to engage this ecosystem more effectively? And many countries are looking at ideas of contract-based, results-based contracting, looking at paying for results as opposed to paying for inputs. And I think there are great opportunities with EdTech, with learning analytics, to be able to more effectively gather this data to determine whether indeed, if I'm providing an adaptive learning system, whether those seventh graders are actually reaching those goals of seventh grade math or not. The other interesting aspect is building back on empowering teachers, and the discussion around decentralization is ways in which you might be able to decentralize the procurement of services themselves. And whether that can be decentralized to the school, to the teachers themselves to determine kind of what are the types of solutions that they find most impactful. In our portfolio at the bank, we do finance these results. I think 70 some odd percent, 77% or so is results-based financing. But of every dollar that we spend on these projects, we spend around 50 cents or 33% on verification of results, on just determining whether the results have been met. And this is a challenge also when you look at kind of another innovative financing model of social impact funds. You still need to kind of verify whether the results have been met. It's the same problem with any type of PPP contract, that if you do a PPP, a private-public partnership, and you have a contract for X number of years, you have a service level agreement, you still need an independent verifier to determine whether those goals have been met. So this is a big challenge. And one area that we're looking at that I'll end on is one that we were talking about before we started, Anna, is the promise of using blockchain technology to kind of decentralize and make more transparent those inputs. We just did a project in Colombia that was focused on a conditional cash transfer program. So the idea of providing resources to students that are out of school to incentivize them to enroll in a skill building program, stay in that program, graduate, and develop skills. And what we did was we, converted the Colombian pesos into a crypto token so that the flow of those resources from the donor down to the school to the student was completely transparent. So again, an assumption that would be interesting to discuss, whether kind of transparency on flow of funds is important to crowd in additional investment. So that was one benefit. And the second was building in kind of the results into what they call in crypto a smart contract, which is basically an if-then statement. If I enroll in this program, then I will be dispersed some tokens. If I finish an assignment, then I will be dispersed some tokens. If I finish it and get over 80% grade, then I will be dispersed some tokens. So being very transparent also on the results and building the results into the actual learning process to kind of avoid this additional layer and cost of kind of independent verification. So these are kind of two of the hopes that we see in areas of additional resource that we want to engage in terms of bringing additional transparency and hopefully through transparency, additional financing to the education sector. So let me stop there. I'm very excited to engage in this discussion. And again, thanks again for the invite.
Robert, thank you so much. You have painted a very rich landscape of issues we want to get into today with the rest of the panel. So I'm going to dive right in. I want to first introduce our other panelists today. Today we have Neku Edun, the regional lead at the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning ICT at Mastercard Foundation, and Rohan Wadhwa, principal at Lumos Capital Group. And so we have a fantastic panel with us today, and so many topics that I want to get into. We talked about transparency and equity and decentralization, verification, safety, earning to learn and learning to earn, which I think are two phenomenal new concepts. But I'd love to hear a little bit from Neku and Rohan from their perspective, their own landscape, from regionally and thematically, how this fits into their work. And then we can dive into more specific questions shortly. Neku, would you like to start?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion today. So by way of introduction, my name is Neku, and I am the West Africa lead for the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning at the Mastercard Foundation. Now, the goal of the center is to spark innovation and promote promising practices in the best use of ICT for teaching and learning. We all know access to a quality education, whether it be in person or by using technology, is critical in preparing the youth of Africa for their future livelihoods. And we've seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has only reinforced our belief in the power of technology to break down barriers and enable access to education for all, but in particular, access for the most disadvantaged and especially young women. So when the Mastercard Foundation established the center, it was on the back of many, many months of listening to understand. We listened to young people aiming to understand their challenges, their problems, and their opportunities, because young people have the solutions to their problems. The foundation sort of acts as a catalyst, and together we're able to co-create to take these solutions to scale and create an environment where young people can access dignified and fulfilling work. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I want us all to just pause for a second and come back to basics. We've all just come out of lockdowns during the pandemic, but most of us are so blessed to be able to work from home and even have our children learn from home. How many of us have thought, how many people don't have that access? In Africa, numerous people do not have this luxury. And the basic right to continue to learn was not an equal opportunity for all. So before we can build any technology solutions, we must all lean in to see how we can plug some basic infrastructure gaps. How can one access edutech solutions when in most cases they do not have access to the internet, to devices, and sometimes even to basic electricity? So the aim is to catalyze existing solutions that have a key understanding of your local problems. So Anna, I'm looking forward to engaging today in this conversation, and I want to find more ways that we can continue to build supportive ecosystems that truly allow young entrepreneurs to thrive. Thank you.
Neku, you make such a good point. We sometimes get so caught up in the excitement of new technologies that we forget that 3 billion people still don't have access to internet, and so many others around the world, about 2/3, lack basic access to other, what we call human basic needs, and energy, and scarcity and all that. I would love to hear Rohan's perspective from his world in the capital markets, and then dive into our conversation. Really excited to hear more from you, Neku, in a little bit.
Hey, everybody. I'm excited to be here with some other fantastic panelists. As a way of background as well, so I am part of the founding team of Lumos Capital Group. We are a growth equity firm exclusively focused on education and the future of work. But in the context of this discussion, we are investors that are looking for a financial return, in part with an impact return. And our core belief is that there's a high degree of collinearity between generating good outcomes and generating financial returns. The companies that are doing the best in terms of outcomes in our sector will also be the ones, hopefully, that will be scaling the best. At least that's our intention. As a fund, what we're focused on are investing in companies in sort of that growth stage. So we're usually backing companies in the $10 to $30 million range, and helping them grow further. What we usually come to the conversation with is our own impact framework. That impact framework, even in the sort of financial returns model, is focused on 3 different things. So we're often looking at first, quality. So we're pushing entrepreneurs and companies to better define what does quality look like what outcomes are you solving for, and how are you doing to get further in that goal. Second is on access, which is a big part of the conversation today. So is the way you're pricing the product, isolating off a certain part of the market, or, as Neku just mentioned, is the way that is delivered, whether through hardware or whatnot, also isolating a certain part of the market. So how are we making sure we're promoting access? And the third piece is equity. Is the way the product is delivered, is the way it's priced, is the business model serving different demographic groups and different types of people around the world? And so that's usually the framework we come to the conversation with, is sort of pushing, hey, does this investment fit with how we think about quality, access, and equity in any investment decision that we make?
And Rohan, I would love to talk to you a little bit more during this conversation, because I do feel that the normative sort of investment capital approach is that, doing well and doing good, the moniker you've probably heard a lot, are somewhat incompatible, that they can't coexist. But so I'd love to hear more about how you go about making decisions like that, and are these unicorns really out there, and have you, if you can speak a little bit more to that. But I'd like to get back to Neku here a little bit, and maybe ask you to comment a little bit on the landscape of EdTech in Africa, from your perspective and what you've seen. What does it look like there? You mentioned the pandemic has set things back a little bit, but I'd be very curious to hear more about what you've seen.
Thank you, Anna. So one of the key things that we've learned is that the solutions have to be a demand-driven, we have to take a demand-driven approach. We don't like to sort of impose ideas on the region, but really coming in and listening first and understanding what are their core problems, and then finding solutions that are already existing and how can we support to catalyze that. I think that there's also, as Robert said, there is a huge gap in accessing data. So even building some of these solutions that, basic data that entrepreneurs are able to find in other regions is lacking here. So as partners in all of us, to fill those gaps that are needed for entrepreneurs to actually thrive, and being able to access data, being able to, plug in some government policies and where those gaps are, that's really important. So at the moment, what we're doing and what the foundation is focused on is really bringing together stakeholders to ensure that there is a thriving ecosystem for these entrepreneurs to actually grow on top of.
Perhaps, sorry, Neku, did you have anything else to add?
No, you were on mute, I was saying.
Of course, one of us has to do this, at least on one conversation.
That's the famous thing for Zoom this year.
Of course. Robert, maybe this is a good time to bring you in, sort of, piggybacking on what Neku was saying. When we talk about EdTech, we mean more than just, augmented reality and virtual learning platforms. We're talking about a spectrum, and Neku was mentioning how in some areas where she's working on, it's about simply being able to figure out how to even do data collection. Maybe you could comment a little bit on what does that look like in, how did the landscape really change during COVID? Now that, that the spectrum of technologies was so wide, from WhatsApp groups to radio, did you see sort of a change also in the mentality of how a variety of investors look at how solutions would come about?
Yeah, no. So the title of the paper that we put out for the strategy is Reimagining Human Connections. So very much focused on the way technology can bring people together, can create networks, as opposed to a focus on the technology itself. And I think what we found also was during the pandemic that many of the old technologies were being mixed in a kind of a multimodal way to provide more interactivity. So countries that had invested in radio and television were ahead, and they were able to leverage those technologies, but they mixed them also with mobile technologies, for instance, for providing some feedback to a teacher, to a parent, to even a call center for teachers. So what we saw a lot was countries that had invested in technology were further ahead. Secondly, you saw a lot of multimodal. So you saw the combination of radio, TV, online, and mobile being delivered. And third, the importance of kind of building in that kind of networking aspect and that support structure to parents, to teachers, and ultimately to students themselves. And we found that there was a huge amount of learning loss, that you cannot replace what you had as a face-to-face system with purely online without building in these types of human connections. And there's a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking about hybrid models going forward. And a lot of countries are looking at these investments in terms of ways to make their systems more resilient. But it really needs to be based not necessarily on the technology, but on these human connections. And I would just echo what Neku said, is that we still have a huge access divide. So COVID has exposed, we had thought that we were getting more and more kids into school, but COVID exposed this huge digital access divide where we have to kind of double down now on thinking about models to provide different forms of connectivity to those that are unconnected.
It's very interesting that you both mentioned sort of the ecosystem approach, right? It's not what this, we learned that learning was not just the school, the physical space of the school, but it was all of these other things. It was the teachers, it was the students, it was all the stakeholders, the parents, the entire community itself. So I wanted to ask you both about how you feel teachers, students, this entire ecosystem of stakeholders can be brought in through EdTech to participate in sort of this new models of learning and new and sort of the post-pandemic world of learning. And maybe this is a question for all of you, and I would love to see one of you just lead and maybe the others chime in.
Okay, maybe I'll. Oh, good. Neku, go ahead. I see you've unmuted. So.
No, I was able no, go ahead, Robert.
No, I mean, I think it provides, you know, unique opportunities and a different mindset as well. I mean, I think it's you know, this comes down to really change management and culture change of how you can most effectively work with others, how you can recognize kind of what your strengths and weaknesses are, both as a teacher, as a system, as a school, as a system. At the system level, you know, encouraging ministries of education to kind of identify kind of what are the types of capacities they have and what are the capacities they don't have, and who in the ecosystem could support them to do things that they don't have the capacities to do, whether it's providing innovative content, whether it's providing a better access and connectivity, whether it's thinking about the policies that are necessary at the national level. For instance, this idea of zero rating, of providing educational data at a lower cost, down to the school level of how principals need to think about how to support teachers to engage with students, how principals now need to consider parents more in terms of the ecosystem and engaging them in the learning process, how to think about peer learning and ways in which students can help other students to kind of learn. There were some fascinating examples of how at school you had kind of the older siblings helping the younger siblings. And then, you know, with the teachers themselves, one of the big issues was isolation. These teachers just felt isolated in the classroom. They felt overwhelmed with kind of the amount of information they had to gather themselves. So how do you think about creating networks and providing support structures for teachers that, you know, they don't have to do it all. They don't have to know everything. How do you bring in kind of additional expertise? There were great examples, I think it was in Argentina, where during their television programs, you know, they brought in journalists, they brought in doctors to kind of provide the content, and then the teachers were providing the kind of the pedagogical input. So again, thinking about the entire ecosystem and where the value exists in the ecosystem, and recognizing that you don't have all the knowledge, and that you can you know, create these networks to bring greater value to the student. Over.
Neko, did you want to add something? Neko, did you want to add something to that, or we could dive into other directions as well?
No, I'd love to just add a quick point, because I love that Robert gives us sort of the global landscape, and I can dive in and give you the regional landscape. And I think that, you know, the pandemic, it really further highlighted that the most disadvantaged people are the ones that really suffer when there's a crisis. So, and especially in parts of Africa where perhaps we hadn't got to this digital age, and a lot of governments were still, you know, in that analog age. The pandemic really showed that we have to speed that process up, and it's done wonders for technology, because the amount of people that were not able to just access, well, education is a basic necessity, and they weren't able to access that. I think governments have seen that we do need to catalyze that growth and getting our governments to be more digital, especially state schools, and especially the gap with teachers as well. So during the pandemic, a lot of teachers in state schools can't actually use computers. So there's that skill gap as well. You're saying to them, go and, you know, teach people online, but they don't know how to do that. So there is a bit of upskilling that needs to be done. So there is, again, I go back to that, the landscape of strengthening the landscape so we can build on top of it. And I think that in a lot of parts in Africa, those are the gaps that we still have to plug.
You know, Neku and Robert, you both bring up an interesting point, right? Governments are sort of the chief investors in education. And so we've relied on them so much to kind of push things forward. And of course, there are parts of the world that are still a bit behind in the technological advance. And we've seen the past year and a half, technology has advanced and the digitalization has grown almost a decade in a year, right? So I wanted to bring Rohan into this and talk a little bit about who the other investors are. You guys, obviously, at Lumos are the other investors. How are you looking to bridge sort of the gaps where the governments or government investment are not able to meet the same way that you guys might be able to meet?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think it's probably heart to this discussion. What probably needs to improve in general is more information flow across capital sources. So, I'm part of right now sort of this capital alignment project. We'll meet companies or projects or initiatives where, look, maybe growth capital is not the right set of capital. Maybe it's foundation capital. Maybe it's family office capital. Maybe it's government capital that is the right. Maybe it's debt capital that is the right thing for the project to be there. That doesn't mean those same capital sources cannot lock arms and be sort of in the same spirit of what should be furthered, and I think right now they operate more in silos. That said, I think what we try and do, I mean, Neko seems to be sharing the same spirit, is sort of like listen first. So a lot of our work is also talking to teachers, talking to schools, talking to principals, and hearing, hey, what are the biggest priorities? What are your biggest pain points that are not being served from other things in your toolkit? How can we support companies to put more of that in front of you? For example, we invested in a company called Elevation Education. Elevation Education serves exclusively ELL students, primarily in the US, English language learners. They're folks who are coming in typically not as English as their first language. They're a growing group in the US, but the tools at the disposal of some of the administrators and teachers were not, at the level that was needed to be able to differentiate things in the classroom to serve these different students. So, for example, you might be teaching math in a certain way that is ignoring the needs of ELLs in the classroom. So how do we complement those tools and sort of bring other tools to the table to sort of promote more access, in this case with ELLs? So all to say, I think like technology investment has a role to play. It's a growing role. It's one that has higher velocity than sometimes government spend. So if you look at the US with like 600 billion of spend in education, where those dollars are being spent has lower velocity, lower change than, let's say, the 10 billion or so that's being spent in technology in the US. But I've just shared the scale. So there is a big, difference in scale. And I think those different parties, it's not just technology investment in government, but debt, other forms of capital, can probably improve in how much they talk to each other, which today I think is probably, way too little.
You bring up a very good point, Rohan, that there's a spectrum of types of investments, right? So my next question is perhaps for you all. You come from different types of investment pockets or buckets. What are some of, can you speak, and this is a question for all three of you, can you speak a little bit about examples of other types of innovative types of financing? I know, Rohan, for you, it's obviously a very normative capital investment firm, but what other ideas are out there? And Robert and Neku, this is for you both as well, coming from the foundation point of view, coming from the intergovernmental body point of view. I'd love to hear sort of what examples out there of other types of financing exist. Rohan or Neku or Robert, who wants to go first? Or I will volunteer you.
Ladies first, I suppose. So I think for entrepreneurs, it's, we focus a lot on, this topic of financing, but actually entrepreneurs need more than that. And being able to take something off of someone's plate is helping them save having to spend on that thing. And a big gap in the overall technology ecosystem on the continent is finding staff, finding skilled people to work with you. So, or being able to get business development support. So the way that the foundation supports these entrepreneurs is, again, our belief is co-create, collaborate. And we're able to pull together stakeholders that can then support the entrepreneurs to build supporting ecosystems. I was in a talk once in Silicon Valley, and I remember they said the way that Silicon Valley works is to reduce the risk of failure. So entrepreneurs in the Valley, even if you did fail, you can go on to work with another company, you can find staff. Like, it is that fear of failure and that, just being in an ecosystem that you feel is supporting you so that you can thrive is also really important. Otherwise, entrepreneurs end up wasting so much time and money on bits that they need to plug in, where we can come in and help to support them. So for me, I think that being able to, again, get stakeholders to lean in, create this ecosystem of support is incredibly important. And that actually helps, as a previous entrepreneur myself, greatly helps entrepreneurs to thrive.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, this concept is actually pretty important. You're helping accelerate the entrepreneur, not just giving them some money and then move on. And I think that's so incredibly important. Go ahead, Rohan.
Maybe let me jump in, because I'd like to get Rohan's kind of thoughts on kind of how the culture of entrepreneurs and the public sector can be kind of closed, I guess. And I think that there are kind of three aspects of innovation. One is this focus on results as opposed to inputs. The second on transparency, so that there's clarity on kind of who is providing what and kind of more open data flows. And the third is efficiency of ways in which to kind of get the inputs to the end users that need it. And I think we see a number of challenges when we're kind of working with governments. One is time. Is governments are under pressure to deliver and to disperse resources, and there's very little time to engage the ecosystem, to kind of understand what are the needs of the end user, to kind of do the kind of human-centered design that we all talk about. So again, time is one issue that needs to be sorted out. The other is this issue of procurement, of governments are used to capital expenditures, of procuring, stuff. And one of the challenges with EdTech is the move from capital expenditures to operational expenditures, and kind of these recurrent cost streams, which are important also for any type of private-public partnerships, is ways in which to find space in the financing for these kind of longer-term operational expenditures, whether you think of kind of infrastructure as a service, or software as a service, or education as a service. The third area is this need for different business models. And Rohan, this would be interesting to hear from you, because one of the fears is technology lock. They do these big procurements and they're locked into a technology for the next 10 years. And this is where I talked about kind of this need for a more modular education management system, so that you can have more of a plug and play of different solutions, as well as crowd in more solution providers. So this is kind of the business models that might need to change. And then the fourth is kind of this issue of building off that data interoperability and kind of this openness in terms of data, and kind of how we think about. One example is like adaptive learning providers. They want the data from the public sector, but they don't necessarily want to kind of give their algorithms or their IP. So how do you kind of create that space between the private sector and the public sector, so there is an interchange of essential data, but you're still able to kind of protect some IP? And then the last area is just culture. And again, how do you get kind of public sector to be able to talk to the private sector and these solution providers, because they talk very different languages. Let me stop there.
Rohan,
Go ahead, Anna.
did you want to chime into this? I have a follow-up question on interoperability later on for Robert, but I would love to hear from you as well, Rohan, on all of this.
Sure, yeah. So maybe taking it in stride on the first question on financing and like different needs from entrepreneurs, I would echo what Neku said. That capital can be solved with capital, but capital can also be solved with other things that would be used for the capital. So things like partnership, things like community. We are often going to entrepreneurs and saying, hey, we're not just capital. Like, we will be partners with you on opening up different channels, different geographies, whatever it would be. So, and I think the state of play today in the capital markets is that entrepreneurs are looking for more than just capital. Like, I think they realize, like, look, there's different sources of capital, the same capital, but we're looking for a partner who's going to help us grow and support us for the next, whatever it is, 5 to 10 years. In terms of alternative models, what we have been trying to look for more and more is where capital is aligned with the right incentives. Examples of that are things like ISAs, income share agreements, where you're trying to align the incentives of the university or the skills provider with the student. In this case, you might be charging a student as a percentage of their income post-completion. So if the goal is to get you a job, now I'm incentivized to get you a job because I know I'm only going to get paid if I get you a job. Whereas the prior model would be charging tuition. So yes, I'm going to get paid regardless if I get you a job. And that has created a lot of costs. Similarly, we've looked at stuff in terms of on the employee side or how to build an organization. There's a growing model of employee ownership, having employees take bigger ownership of their own companies, so that you're having everyone have a stronger vested interest in that company's success. And that's a growing model. It's usually done through ESOPs, stock options. In terms of Robert's point of view, I think our questions, I totally agree with a lot of what you said. I think there are like issues in working with governments. We've started to see more of that play out in a positive fashion. We have an investment, as an example, in a company called Open Classrooms. They're based out of Europe, do operations around the world, increasingly more in West Africa. And they, one of their 3 biggest segments is working with government. And the way they do so is really a lot of governments around the world are, particularly through the pandemic, having a number of folks who are unemployed, looking for a job. And in that case, it's a huge outlay for governments because they're paying unemployment support. And so they instead of providing that training themselves, what they've tried, and I think they've run into the issues Robert mentioned, time, they've struggled to figure out the right business model and even just have the skills itself. They've opened up the door to folks like Open Classrooms, who has the agility to provide this at scale and is now sort of retraining and upskilling a number of, this is like in the thousands in France, but now also in other government areas. So that's an example where we see it work. I would say there's also points in the value chain to support what will ultimately make things easier for government. So Robert, you talked about sort of data interoperability and some of the different warehouses. There's things we've looked at like a Clever. Clever, for example, is sort of a single sign-on. So in the past, pre-Clever, let's say, a student, a teacher, administrator would be logging into like 8 different solutions, and that's a big headache. But with Clever, you can sign into one, and that gives you access to all of them. I think that goes through the sort of path of interoperability. There's a lot to do there, but we see that as a huge opportunity. I think it's sort of this. There's always this wave of bundling, unbundling. Like you bundle to make things easier, then you unbundle to make things better in that specific vertical, and then you bundle again because it gets too complicated. And so it's a natural progression of you bundle to make things more streamlined, then you unbundle to be more specialized, then you bundle again, and hopefully that path makes things better in the long run.
It's a fascinating trajectory. I'm also getting some very interesting questions on our live stream on LinkedIn and also here on Zoom. So I wanted to make sure that I'm also asking questions that our audience is asking. So one of the questions that is for you, Robert, is can you expand on your important point of investing in outcomes and results rather than inputs? What does this look like on a practical level when financially supporting an education, technology, innovation in schools, for example? And this is a question from our audience.
Yeah, no, so this is a real challenge. The first one is just defining what are the results that you want to see. That's the first real big challenge. And then I think once you define the results, then the other challenge is then how do you verify those results? And then third, once you define and verify, how do you determine kind of what is the contract for, dispersing based on these results? And this is, we do a lot of this outside of the realm of technology. And I think the hope is that through technology, you can move this, from a national system level down to the classroom level, that you'll be able to capture learning analytics kind of in real time to be able to kind of disperse based on learning gains that are defined. You're going to face the same challenges. How do you define what is learning? What are the metrics that you use to define whether somebody is learning? And then kind of what are the conditions under which you disperse on that? And this is kind of, we talk with a lot of companies that, for instance, are providing solutions for hard to measure skills. And they're collecting tons of data and using algorithms to kind of determine whether somebody has developed communication skills or collaborative problem solving. But it's a bit of a black box. So, they're very reluctant to kind of share what data they're collecting and kind of what are the rule set that they're using to determine whether indeed those skills have been developed. So one of the challenges to really open that black box, create more transparency, yet at the same time provide the incentive for the private company to be able to provide this service, because it's really important and essential. I think the other trend that we're seeing is running schools is really hard, and there's probably not a market. There's a difficult market for running schools. There are private schools, but can you do it at scale is a question. There have been some kind of good examples. I think one trend we're seeing is a lot of the technology companies that have come in, both in the US and in different countries, have kind of moved away from running schools and begun to provide service to the government. So kind of let the running of the schools be under the domain of the public sector, but provide them some of the services, the software services, the support to teachers, the data feedback that they require. Some of the areas that they're less well equipped at that can kind of complement the day-to-day running of the school. I think that's another important kind of area to explore.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned that, and it takes me right into the next question, which has also been asked by one of our audience members on the live stream. How do we exactly measure all of this? There's qualitative measuring, quantitative measuring. When it comes to impact investment, things get a little bit tricky. I'd love to hear from Rohan and from Neku next in terms of how they measure success and impact on their investments, even though I know now that they make very different types of investments in their organizations. And then maybe Robert, we can come back to you and you can tell us a little bit about how you do it with World Bank projects. Rohan and then Neku.
Sure. So our process, I think we generally feel like there's not one metric that's sort of like the key metric for every business model and every business. I think we are typically going into each conversation with each portfolio company or prospective investment, trying to lay out a set of metrics that would help us guide to the right outcomes in terms of, upfront when I said around quality, access, and equity. So that could mean, test scores for quality. It could mean, engagement. If, we're trying to develop a love of learning, access could be, average price. It could be things like, what percentage of people are using the free product if it's a freemium model. So we might go down that angle, or using sponsorships to make sure we're giving access. And equity might be some targets in terms of the makeup of the folks that we're serving. So we're generally trying to have a conversation with the entrepreneurs and prospective investments along those different angles. And that's usually what we're then, trying to push towards. And those things are generally met with, positive reactions from the entrepreneurs, because I think, our point of view, generally speaking, is that, generating good outcomes along those three dimensions will serve the business well. So they're generally aligned with that. Yeah, we want to do these things, and we think that's better for our business in the long run as well. I will say that there's probably a theme in capital markets moving more towards a set of metrics that may be more uniform across. And so there's sort of a project around SASB that's trying to get a set of metrics across different industries. So I think they're trying to standardize around, hey, if you are in this industry, here are a set of metrics that are most commonly used that hopefully you can have it be like for other public companies or whatnot. And so I think there's definitely an industry moving in that way. I don't think we're there yet. But for us right now, what we're doing is having deep conversations to outline the metrics that hopefully are serving the companies in the long run.
Thank you, Rohan. So what I'm hearing is that, return on investment, making profit is one of several impact generators that you're talking about here, the way you measure success.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it is like, yes, return on income and profits is let's say an umbrella thing. But even if you had that as your goal, like you wouldn't stop there. You would say, okay, well, how do we get there? It might be like growing customers or growing different products or whatnot. And I think interwoven in that is a lot of these same metrics that we think are important, around, quality, access and equity. So I think that's how we think about it. Again, like it probably starts from like, we think those are going to be the companies that do well. And having those in there allows you to face these trade-offs with a bit more grounding, where you'll say, oh, there's an opportunity to make a lot more money, but that's going to hurt us for our access initiative. And we've already outlined that that's important for us to make long-term sustainable profits. So we might say no to that. Or we might say no to a certain business model as a result. But I think it's important to have that, like I'm being open and saying like, look, we still have to meet a financial return, and we're still going to be pushing that. But our belief is that to drive the best financial return, these are the things that are going to be supporting it. So let's make sure we're conscious about it.
Understood. So to connect sort of the profitability with social impact.
Exactly.
The two have to be together for there to be success. Neku, what about you and the foundation? How do you measure sort of success in your projects?
Thank you. And I think that's a great question, and always it's quite a tricky one. But for us, long-term social change is very important. But of course, what happens on the way to that long-term social change is equally important. Of course, the foundation focuses on marginalized youth, and especially women as well, like making sure that we have an impact on getting women a seat at the table. And so we've got a bit of a sliding scale to measuring impact. So when we're working with these different entrepreneurs, if one entrepreneur, for example, has massive impact on getting more women into the education space, then we might place that, on the sliding scale slightly above, maybe employment, or we sort of do it on a sliding scale. But at the moment, after the reimagining process that we're going through with the pandemic, and I've spoken about these infrastructural challenges, we're really focused on long-term systemic impact. So getting policy, getting data, getting all of that, creating this ecosystem that can in turn help the entrepreneurs to thrive. And I think in the end, it's all these stakeholders, all of us coming together and working together to make sure that the impact is not short term, but is impact that after you're done doing the work, it's still there and it's able to carry on without you. So that's really, really important at the foundation.
So this sense of building legacy as opposed to going in and going out once a project is finished it sounds almost transformational. So it's very interesting to hear from you on that, Neku. What about you, Robert? How do you do that at the bank? How do you measure success when it comes to impact and return and making sure the money is spent well?
So, I mean, we kind of do our economic analysis on kind of return on investment and the kind of potential contribution and earning potential of students. But at the nitty gritty, I mean, you look at access. So there are enrollment rates that you can measure. There's kind of retention and dropout rates. There's graduation rates. And then at the learning, we've very, very much focused on this metric of early grade reading, of can a 10-year-old read a simple paragraph as kind of a metric in terms of learning poverty, with the idea that that reading is fundamental to the development of further skills. And then there's kind of standardized tests and kind of the exams that are given at the national, international level. But we're also, technology provides an opportunity for more and more formative assessment, which gets, much more difficult to kind of attribute and measure, but extremely important in terms of kind of this idea of the growth mindset of students can continually learn and fail, which is not necessarily captured in standardized tests. That failure is an important to kind of the growth of the individual. And these things are obviously really, really hard to measure, to attribute to inputs. And then the other challenge is just the time lag. I mean, education takes a long time to see results. And it's not like, health where you can provide a vaccine and kind of see the data, pretty quickly. I mean, a lot of our investments are 4 or 5 year investments, and we kind of project beyond the investment in terms of the returns to that investment. So it's a very tricky area to measure, but it's something that I think we can do more of in terms of skills, in terms of defining these competencies that we want to see with youth, in terms of having that dialogue with the private sector, in terms of kind of what are the types of competency, how do they measure these competencies, in terms of thinking about the ways in which pedagogy and learning can develop these competencies, in real time. So again, I think there's a lot of great potential in terms of going deeper on kind of what we mean by digital skills, from what Neku said of just using a computer to being able to kind of use advanced digital skills, to being able to develop some of these 21st century skills to kind of add value to any industry. Over. I think Anna, you're frozen. I don't know. Maybe Neku, does that resonate with you? We'll jump into the moderation role.
Absolutely. And, I wanted to add that the foundation does have a long-term goal, and that is for Young Africa Works, for example, the goal is to have 30 million young people in dignified and fulfilling work by 2030. So a great way to remember that is 30 million by 2030. And it's really important that these young people themselves find the work that, is dignified and fulfilling. So it's not, oh, okay, here we've given you a laborer work or a low-level civil servant work and go away and, you're employed. But it's that young person themselves have to feel like the work they're doing is dignified and fulfilled. And by doing that, they're able to help their families and help their community. So that's also really important at the foundation. Welcome back, Anna.
Well, I apologize for my little technical snafu here, but I'm back. Can you hear me all? Fantastic. I hope I froze in a very funny face. Well, my next question is a question that also came from our audience, and it's a very, I would say, it's a question that's also been on my mind. Let's say that I'm an entrepreneur or someone who has a great idea in EdTech from anywhere in the world. As a new startup, what are my options for financing? What is the spectrum out there from seed capital to foundation grants to capital investment? Maybe all of you can comment a little bit on, from your perspective and your own work, how would I go about getting some seed capital for my startup?
I could start, and if you guys want to piggyback on top of it. So I think maybe along the spectrum of non-dilutive capital to dilutive capital, and especially at a seed stage, there are forms like you said, grants you can apply for. There are competitions that often, are supporting entrepreneurs. Foundation and government, are areas of capital that you can tap into. Generally speaking, those 4 areas are non-dilutive, meaning, they're either given to you for free, or they're forgiven, or there's no equity on the back of it. Moving forward, then you have slightly dilutive ones, but still, predominantly non-dilutive, which are accelerator programs or incubator programs, where you're basically part of a cohort of other entrepreneurs. There's an ecosystem of folks around there to support you, whether they're former veterans in the industry or not. Typically speaking, they'll give you a bit of capital. They'll take a little bit of equity as part of wanting to support you, but they'll also connect you with other investors to build up to the next phase. Similar to that, but without sort of the ecosystem around it, is venture debt. Often there will be venture debt players it's more debt-like, in that you would maybe pay interest on it, or interest would accrue. And typically they'll ask for a little bit of equity too, in the form of warrants. That's an option that you can have at your disposal. And then onto the more dilutive side is investment capital, like folks like ourselves or others that are more earlier stage would give you capital as in return, asking for a percentage of your company. So it's sort of non-dilutive stuff like grants, competitions, foundation, government money, slightly dilutive stuff like incubators, accelerators, venture debt, and then you have investment capital.
Neku, from your perspective at the foundation, what are some options here for someone who wants to seek out capital investment or other financing opportunities for their startup or idea?
I think you've just been given a masterclass in accessing finance by Rohan. So that was a brilliant answer, covering all the different sectors. But we also partner with financial institutions to bridge the risk in loaning to SMEs. But I think everything that Rohan has said is absolutely perfect. Those are your options.
Fantastic. Robert, did you want to add to this, or could I ask you a question about interoperability that you mentioned earlier? You made some very interesting remarks about sort of the challenges that and lack of interoperability has brought into this world. Is the answer to that decentralization or more centralization? Tell us a little bit about how we can fix that gap.
No, I mean, I think it's kind of a multifaceted challenge. I think it starts with both the technology and the policy side. I mean, some of the promising technologies that we see. For instance, there's a project in India through the Xstep Foundation. They've developed kind of an open source platform called Sunbird that is built on what's called kind of a microservices architecture. So being able to kind of take a full stack solution and kind of demodularize it, in which kind of the inputs are interoperable. The idea of having open APIs is another kind of policy choice that can be made. That if you're providing a service, that those access to that data and the APIs need to be open. So there's some policy decisions that would need to be made. The other is kind of just having some standards in terms of the type of data and content that is being accessed through the system. And this is there are some interesting examples. For instance, called H5P is the name of the organization, supported by the Norwegians, in which it's kind of an open HTML content system that is interoperable with Moodle, Canvas, a number of different platforms. So kind of having these standards or these systems in which you can develop content regardless of the platform. So it's both kind of the idea of how do you kind of push the opportunity to develop content and participate in the ecosystem down to the solution providers, the teachers, but at the same time kind of having this vision and this architecture to support that, which is it's not a trivial thing, but there are some interesting examples moving in that direction.
We're reaching now almost with a few minutes left before we wrap up our discussion, and I wanted to make sure that our audience still had a chance to send any of the questions. So now's your chance to send us any final sort of thoughts and comments and questions for our panel. But I wanted to take us back to all three of you and ask about the role of technologies and how they are actually have accelerated so much in the past 18 months. And Robert, this is something that you mentioned about earlier, sort of these new models of how we're using blockchain and crypto and all of that. Are these realistic models that the entire world can access pretty quickly in the next decade? What we noticed specifically, and you know, I'll bring in you, Neku, here, is in Africa, for example, we saw an acceleration from analog to digital very quickly, right? So are we going to experience this kind of acceleration from, you know, internet 1.2.0 to blockchain in the next 5-6 years? Because the pandemic has brought us to that level of acceleration right now. Or are we still going to see some sort of a slow adoption? From your perspective, both from the financing, you know, innovative startups to financing innovative projects to working with this ecosystem, where do you see us headed right now? Neku, would you like to start first? And I'll ask Rohan, and then we'll conclude with Robert.
Sure. No, so sadly, the short answer is no, we're not going to see, on the continent anyway, such accelerated growth. It will be slow paced, and we again must all lean in to make sure that the foundation is there for us to be able to build on top of it. It's, you know, when you introduce solutions that only address 5%, 10%, 1% of the population, you're just leaving way too many people out of the conversation. And we must find a way that we can carry everyone along. You know, we cannot have conversations where it's only people that have access to those resources that are able to, you know, enjoy this growth that technology is able to provide. All of the, with the work that we're all doing and the resources that we all have access to, it's important as stakeholders that we don't leave anybody behind when we're coming up with these solutions. So sadly, no, I do not think on the continent that we're going to see such fast-paced growth, but I am excited and encouraged that, you know, there is, you know, almost a proof of success for the need for technology in education. And so the stakeholders required to make, you know, these foundations work are now listening and open to making sure that we can be a part of this quick acceleration and not be forgotten or left behind by the world.
Neku, do you think that we could change some of that equation if more of the inventions in Africa?
Sorry, Anna, I lost you for a bit. Can you ask that again, please?
My apologies, my connection is unstable today. Do you believe that equation, that acceleration can change if more investment goes into youth in Africa or new startups in Africa?
No, absolutely. But again, for these startups to thrive, so a great example is one of our companies called Hitch, and his solution was brought on by, he has an autistic daughter, and for years and years in West Africa, he could just not find anybody to help her. And somebody suggested, you know, move to Canada. And he moved to Canada, and, you know, they found that the way she wanted to learn, or the way that worked best for her, was, you know, videos and just a different style of learning. And I love that he didn't just say, okay, now I'm off in Canada, I've got it better. He was thinking about the people back home that were like him and his daughter and didn't have that access. And so when he went back to build his solution, he initially built it needing the internet. And he quickly realized that 90% of the state schools that he went into don't have access to the internet. So he changed it to a box that it sort of runs on a local area network connection, and you can update this box with the curriculum needed. But the state schools do not need the internet to access it. And that's why I stress that working with entrepreneurs that understand their regional problem is the best way to catalyze that change. So him understanding that actually not everybody has access to the internet, and so I have to build for that region, is the way to bring about change in these regions. But it would be great if he didn't have to do that, if they just had access to the internet. And so for us, it's, you know, not just working with these entrepreneurs, but being able to create this ecosystem for them that, again, they can thrive, and being able to plug those infrastructure gaps. And until we do that, we will be leaving people behind. So that is really, really important to continue. I know I sound a bit like a broken record at the moment, but Anna's frozen on a very interesting but yes, it's extremely important that people actually have that access. Should I pass it on to Rohan?
I can just jump in if you'd like.
Yeah.
I think to give another region's perspective, but also doubling down on what you just said. I also really echo what we look for, as well as sort of, we call it like the
Rohan and Robert, my apologies.
Oh, you're back, Anna. You're good. I was just going to share a bit of, so let's say like the North American region. But before that, we usually look for what we call like lived experiences, like entrepreneurs who have gone through the lived experience. And
I apologize.
It's usually, similar to what you just said, Neku, is like we're looking for entrepreneurs who have lived through the problem, have lived in the context to then make the solution, because then you just understand all the nuances of it that much more than someone who may be coming into it opportunistically, not having, lived through it. In terms of, acceleration of growth, I mean, we have seen, fortunately in North America, a huge growth in, let's say, things like the device to student ratio. It's unfortunately not the same in other regions, but we're definitely seeing it here, where in the past it was maybe 3 to 1, getting closer to 2 to 1, and now it's very close to 1 to 1 in terms of students having a device in the classroom. And I think that opens up possibilities to do things synchronously, but also asynchronously. So that's an opportunity there. There's a lot going on in the future of work that's also changing how we think about growth and what can be done. Whether that's working from home a bit, whether it's working from the workplace a few days. And so I do think the pandemic's probably created foundational layers of new growth, like whether it's this hybrid work environment, whether it's the device student ratio. So I think it's opened up a ton of opportunity, at least here. Hopefully that also channels through to other areas. So at least we're pretty optimistic, at least on the future for North American education growth. I don't know if you want to end, Robert.
No, I'll take a bit of a contrarian view. I do think that there are enormous potentials for acceleration. I mean, you look at the internet 30 years ago, and we still have an internet divide. But you look at mobile, and you have 90% of populations with some access to mobile connectivity, of which Africa kind of led the way in terms of mobile solutions, mobile access, mobile innovations in terms of paying for prepaid cards, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of innovation pockets that we'll see. We'll always have a degree of inequality, and that's going to be our job to kind of identify those that don't have access, that don't have the same opportunities, and to focus on those. But it's a constantly moving target. And if we look kind of at some of the innovations and what we're able to do now, in terms of access to content, access to people, connectivity, it's a vast improvement over where we were 20, 30 years ago. The other point is the cost. I mean, costs are dropping. Access to devices, access to computers is more and more affordable. So I think the trends in terms of costs are in a positive trajectory. The nature of software itself and kind of the zero kind of marginal cost of software is incredible. I mean, you look at kind of, it's almost too much information. One of the challenges is the curation challenge of trying to kind of identify what is the good content that is accessible. So again, I think that the opportunity to kind of leverage the inherent property of software and translate that to also data, which is going to be a big challenge in terms of having equal access to data. And this issue, again, Anna, around interoperability of data. And then finally, since you mentioned it, kind of this opportunity around, the use of new technologies, blockchain in terms of Web 3.0. I do think if you look at the developer community, there's a huge amount of innovation going into this space. Where it goes, nobody really knows. But what's interesting about it, the technology itself creates a certain amount of kind of digital scarcity in the sense that it creates new opportunities for business models to be able to provide value that is different from kind of a proprietary model and different from a purely open source model where many of the incentives were lacking. And then we were talking before we came on of this experiment in El Salvador, where they've kind of the first country, I think, that have kind of opened Bitcoin as a legal tender. I think they've banked more people in the first weeks than they have in the prior 40 years. So the opportunities to kind of incentivize individuals to be creative, to be able to participate in networks, and to be able to kind of earn transparently through their contribution and value to those networks, I think is going to be a fascinating space to follow in the next 5-10 years. And I think it's going to move really quick. Thanks, Anna.
Well, thank you so much for being patient with me while I was dealing with my technical difficulties on this EdTech panel. You've been phenomenal to actually carry on the conversation without your moderator. Thank you so much, and apologies if I interrupted anybody during the conversation. I wanted to invite Elias Felfoul from the World Innovation Summit on Education. He will help me recap, key takeaways and recap the panel discussion today, which has been incredibly informative. I wanted to thank you all and thank the Qatar Foundation and the UN mission of the state of Qatar in New York for helping us put together this session today. And thank our speakers and our hosts again for this wonderful opportunity to have this global discussion, and of course our audience. And Elias, I will link back to you before my internet forsakes me again.
Thank you very much, Anna. I totally understand what you've been through in DC and New York recently with the storm, and I know it affected a little bit the communication and internet. So we do understand, and please don't worry at all. You've done a terrific job by moderating this session. Robert, you picked it up super well as well. Thank you very much for smoothly taking the role of Anna and pass on some conversation to Rohan and Neko, which I thank very much. My name is Elias Felfoul. I am here to adjourn this day. I am part of the WISE team and part of the team that have been organizing these QF at UNGA series of events. I would like once again to thank everyone who joined us today, whether via their virtual webinar or by tuning in via their live stream on one of the preferred channels. We are super grateful for your participation and welcome your feedback and ideas. We've been lucky enough today to hear such a rich discussion on financing in EdTech, something we actually included key topics of impact, sustainability, and system level change. I have three main key takeaways. One is the challenge we discussed by our speakers today was this idea of building regional and global ecosystem capable of overlap, collaboration, and partnership. We have unfortunately built systems that have calcified and are no longer able to realize true innovation and the leveraging of existing data, technology, and methodologies in other contexts. COVID has certainly catalyzed the beginning of a much needed change. However, if we want to see a replication of some type of dynamic systems, we've heard about today in some select countries, we need to get better at learning from each other and communicating those lessons for the greater good. My number two takeaway is basically another interesting point that was raised, was the need for different business models that can fit into more modular education management system that allow for iterative, agile institutions that are able to meet the needs of their stakeholders as they evolve. Robert, I think you mentioned the crypto token-based financing to result-based contract. The way we approach the procurement and partnership with technology provider needs to be revisited for the 21st century learning ecosystem. My final takeaway will be the idea of entrepreneurs looking for more than just capital to support the building and scaling of their ventures. This is certainly resonant with the work that we do here at WISE. Entrepreneurs are, of course, invested in the evolution of more innovative financing models suggested by some of the speakers today. However, providing them with ecosystems capable of delivering contributors with the key skills and competencies mean sustainable growth and accelerated innovation. In order to realize these type of system changes that we've explored today, the work as always needs to take place from the ground up and build our communities first. We have 2 more days of forums and we hope you will join us to all of them. Tomorrow, Tuesday, also at the same time, 4 p.m. Doha time, 9 a.m. New York, we will continue our series with a discussion on youth and decision-making, featuring leaders from Educate Lanka Foundation, the Digital Citizen Fund, the Amal Alliance, and the CEO of WISE. Since the coming generation of young leaders will be the one tasked with the burden of managing some of humanity's biggest crises, how can we truly include them in decision-making now? On last day, on Wednesday, for the 4th and final session in the series, we will look at how digital credentialing and recognition system will broaden the range and quality of learning opportunities. Leaders from MC Burning Glass, Bright Hive, T3 Innovations Network, Weaving Lab, and Kaplan will give insights on the brave new world of the skills economy, microbadging, and credentialing. As a reminder, the record are available on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And please join us tomorrow for the 3rd session in this series, which will focus on youth and decision-making. As a reminder, this is a pivotal session that will lead Qatar Foundation to Youth for Climate Forum in Milan, and then COP. And the final stage will be in Doha for the WISE Summit 2021. I want to thank you once again for the speakers today, and I want to thank all the participants. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again tomorrow at 9 a.m. New York, 4 p.m. Doha time. Have a great evening. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies again. Thank you, Robert, for taking over.